But then he ended up dropping out of law school to do some killing. Hi there, my name's Leach. I'm a real-life lawyer on a mission to demystify the law and how it affects your everyday life. In today's Get Ready With Me video, I want to talk about Ted Bundy. And I know what you're thinking, Leach, it's been done before. To which I would say, okay, but I'm not here to just tell you the story of Ted Bundy. I'm here to talk about the law. Specifically, I want to talk about the Ted Bundy trials and what it's like to try a serial killer for murder. Won't you join me? Great, then let's do it. First, I want to offer the following disclaimer, and that is that I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. Nothing that I say should be construed as legal advice, and you should always seek the advice of a licensed attorney if you have any legal questions. Oh, and while I'm talking about this, I'm also going to be putting on my makeup. Alright, so in case you are new to true crime, let's just get a little bit of the backstory out of the way, just so that we can catch everyone up to speed. Not really interested in spending a ton of time on Ted Bundy as a person, because he's vile, and I'm not really interested in spending too much time talking about murderers, because I don't think they really deserve that much of a spotlight. But just for context, basically Ted Bundy was born in 1946 and led a pretty unremarkable life until he started murdering. He grew up, he dropped out of college, he became interested in politics in his 20s, what white guy isn't? He goes back to college, he finishes college, he gets some mediocre scores on his LSATs and decides to go to law school. But then he ended up dropping out of law school to do some killing. It's never been confirmed exactly how many people he killed, but he eventually confessed to over 30 murders, mostly in the Pacific Northwest and in Colorado and Utah. He killed so many freaking people, like I could not do justice to all of their stories, so I'm not gonna go into that. You can read his Wikipedia page if you want to. I'm just going to cover the ones that led to actual court time and convictions for him. So by the time he had dropped out of law school and started doing his killing, it was the 70s. And the story of, I think, one of the only potential victims of his that actually made it out alive is the story of Carol DaRonch. DaRonch. On November 8th, 1974, Carol DaRonch was shopping at a mall. Malls were fun and new in the 70s. She came out of the mall and was approached by a man who identified him as Officer Roseland. He was a police officer, and he told her he had seen someone attempting to break into her car while she was in the mall and asked if she would accompany him to the police department to file a report. And you know, it was the 70s. People trusted people a little bit more. I mean, like, things were wild back then. So she just went with him, got in his car, which I assume was not a police car, unmarked, and they drove off to the police station. And as he started driving, she noticed that he was not headed in the direction of the police station, and she mentioned that to him, and he immediately pulled over, pulls out some handcuffs, and attempts to handcuff her. In the ensuing struggle, I'm sure she was flailing, she was fighting back, he accidentally attaches both handcuffs to one wrist, so he doesn't successfully handcuff her, and she's able to get out of the car and run away. That same night at a high school nearby, a female student went missing during a school play. The drama teacher and another female student said that some kind of creepy guy had come up to them that night and asked them if they would accompany him out to the parking lot to look at a car or something, or to identify a car. And then another student said that they saw some creepy guy just kind of pacing back and forth behind the auditorium. When cops searched the area where this girl went missing in the back of the auditorium, they found a key on the ground. The key unlocked the handcuffs that were on Carol DaRonch's wrist. Pretty bad. That was in November 1974. Then in January 1975, Caryn Campbell was in Snowmass Village in Colorado, staying at the Wildwood Inn. While walking down a well-lit hallway between her room and the elevator, she disappeared. Her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road near the resort. She had been killed by blunt blows to the head as well as deep lacerations in her body. 10 months later, in October 1975, Bundy was placed in a police lineup. His activities had drawn a lot of suspicion from cops, and so they were trying to get enough evidence to build a case against him. They had recently impounded his vehicle, and they had found the hairs of 3 different women inside, including the hair of Carol DaRonch and Caryn Campbell. The lineup that Ted Bundy was placed in, it turned out, was for Carol DaRonch and the assault and kidnapping that she had reported. She immediately identifies Ted Bundy as her assailant. So he was arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping and assault, and his trial happened in February 1976. At this trial, he had a lawyer, and the lawyer suggested that he waive his right to a jury trial because the case had gotten so much press that it would be impossible to find an impartial jury for him. You have a constitutional right to be tried by a jury of your peers, but you also can waive that right, and in some situations it's a good idea to do so. It was probably right to do so here as well. When a jury trial is waived, then it becomes what's called a bench trial, where a judge sits in and they are the decider of fact. Usually the jury is the decider of fact, meaning did this happen or did it not? Is this witness credible or is it not? Whereas the judge determines the law. What constitutes a murder crime? Under the law, what evidence is admissible? Things like that. In a bench trial, the judge does both law and fact. So in that case, the judge found him guilty of assault and kidnapping. Basically, it took so long for them to bring this case against him because they had to find enough evidence to make it a viable case, and they had to find him. He was pretty notoriously always on the run, but they also needed to ID him as the person who did it. But with the police lineup that Carol DaRonch did, along with the hair strand evidence found in his car, and the evidence of the key that unlocked her wrist and him being spotted near that, all of that combined to be enough to have the judge find beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of these crimes. While he was in prison later that month, the Colorado authorities charged him with the murder of Caryn Campbell, and he was extradited to Colorado from Utah. Extradited is just a fancy word for transferred. He fought against his extradition, meaning he tried to say that it wasn't just for him to be transferred to Colorado while he was serving his sentence in Utah, but they denied it, and he was eventually transferred to Colorado to stand trial for the murder of Caryn Campbell. At this point, he'd also committed a number of murders in like Washington State and stuff for which he was a prime suspect. The problem with this, though, is that the authorities just hadn't developed enough evidence against him to prove that he probably committed the crime so that he could be charged with it. Here, the evidence used against him at trial was pretty strong. He didn't have an alibi. They found the hair strands in his car, and they found in his possession a travel book that had starred next to the Wildwood Inn where the murder occurred or where she was abducted from. But also here, a key fact to consider is that they found her body. Something that seems pretty obvious but is actually an important factor is in a murder trial, you have to prove that a murder actually happened and that a person is actually dead. This is easier when you have a body. The remains of a lot of his victims were never found. If you don't have a body, you have to then prove that there was a murder that happened, which is harder if you don't have evidence like a stab wound or a dead body to begin with. The person could just be missing. There's no conclusive evidence that they're dead, so you have to prove that additional element if you're the prosecutor against the murderer. Many states have statutes where if someone's been missing for a certain number of years, then they are presumed dead. A lot of times it's like 7 years. And the reason for that is so that prosecutors can have a murder trial and say that this person is definitively dead without having to prove it. So once you prove that the person is actually murdered, then the prosecution has to prove intent, at least in the case of premeditated murder, and they have to prove that the murderer was there and actually did it. A lot of times that has to happen through what's called circumstantial evidence, which is just evidence that tends to prove the truth of something but doesn't definitively prove the truth of something, or that it takes a logical leap to get from the evidence to the fact of the crime. So for example, if a person is an eyewitness and they say, I saw her standing over his body covered in his blood, that's not definitive proof that that person killed the dead person, but it does tend to prove that they did, because why would they be standing there over the other person's body covered in their blood holding a murder weapon, for example? The closer the logical leap you can get with circumstantial evidence, the better it is for your case. So because so many of the women that Bundy killed were missing, their bodies were never found, that limited the amount of evidence that prosecutors had against him, which is why he was never charged or convicted for so many of the murders that he allegedly committed. Okay, so he goes to Colorado to stand trial for the murder of Caryn Campbell. While he's there, he decides he wants to be his own lawyer, which, like, what a cocky asshole. 1 year of law school and he's up there thinking he's a criminal defense attorney. Like, I can tell you that first-year law students are not qualified to be criminal defense attorneys, and especially not him. He was said to have mentioned to one of his many girlfriends that he had that he just really couldn't wrap his head around the law in his law school classes. So yeah, probably not a great move on his part to decide to just defend himself, but based on his behavior, I mean, this guy just, it's what he did. He was just a, like, clinical narcissist. He decides to represent himself, which defendants can do. You can proceed pro se, is how it's called, and that just means that you are representing yourself and not having the help of an attorney. Anyway, one day in 1997, during a hearing, he was allowed to go into the law library of the courthouse to do some legal research, and while he was in there, he slipped out a window and ran away. He was on the run for 5 days before he was caught, and then he was put back in prison. Then, 6 months later, he escaped again. Colorado, what's going on? He managed to cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell and then, like, lost 35 pounds and then just slithered out of it. Anyway, so after he escaped, he made his way to Florida, because why not? Then in the early hours of the morning on January 15th, 1978, he snuck into a Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee, Florida, and he bludgeoned 4 of the women in that sorority house and assaulted them using various objects. He then walked 8 blocks away and broke into another woman's house and attacked her as well. All these women were in their early 20s. I mean, they were young, they were pretty, they're just a bunch of Florida sorority girls. And authorities believe it took him like 15 minutes to do all the bludgeoning, and no one really heard anything. And in the house that he broke into 8 blocks away, the authorities found a semen stain and some pantyhose that were used as a mask that they found a hair in that they identified looked like Ted Bundy's hair. I'm telling the story at night. I'm getting a little creeped out, so I need to wrap this up. I hate it. So that was on January 15th. Then on February 9th in Lake City, outside of Tallahassee, he went to Lake City Junior High School where he saw Kimberly Leach walking outside. She had been summoned to the principal's office and was heading there, but he stopped her, got her into his big white van, don't do that, and she was never seen again. Her body was found 7 weeks later. She was 12 years old. That was February 9th. Bundy was later arrested on February 12th after being spotted driving a vehicle that had been reported stolen. His trial for the Chi Omega murders began in June 1979. Despite having 5 lawyers present for him to defend him, he insisted on acting as his own attorney again during this trial. He reportedly basically sabotaged the entire defense effort and was more concerned with being the center of attention than he was with avoiding the death penalty. So the public defender offered a plea deal to Bundy that he would admit to the murders of the 2 Chi Omega girls and Kimberly Leach, the 12-year-old girl, in exchange for getting 75 years flat instead of a death sentence, which initially he was going to take. Partially this plea deal happened because honestly the evidence that the prosecutors had against him wasn't super strong. Also, it was partially in his interest to take the plea deal because if he waited it out, I mean, evidence, it gets old, it gets contaminated, it gets lost, people forget. The case would have gotten weaker and weaker against him, and then he could have withdrawn his plea deal. So it probably would have been in his best interest as well. However, again, his ego got in the way and he decided not to take the plea deal because he didn't want to stand up in front of everyone and admit that he had done it, and he probably just wanted to be on show again because he was a clinical narcissist. And that's true about evidence, is it can get lost, destroyed, deteriorate. I mean, especially if you have like human like hair or, you know, biological evidence, like that stuff doesn't stay good forever. Also, human memories fade. Eyewitness reports are notoriously unreliable, even though many people go to prison due to eyewitness testimony. There have been a number of studies that have shown that humans just don't possess the memory necessary to actually be able to recall things like faces or details about what happened on a certain day or in a certain moment. And the problem with this case is that all the evidence that they had against him was circumstantial. I mean, they had the dead bodies, so that's helpful, I guess, but a reminder that prosecutors have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt every single element of the crime. So they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person's dead. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the murder and that the defendant intended to commit the murder. So this is all, they have to prove every single element beyond a reasonable doubt. So all that Ted Bundy had to do, and all that any criminal defendant really has to do, is poke enough holes in the prosecution's case to put an inkling of doubt into the minds of the jurors. Because theoretically, if the jurors have any doubt as to whether someone actually committed a crime, they should acquit them. Under the theory that we would rather let 1 million men go free than put one innocent man in jail, which is wild when you consider how our criminal justice system actually functions. And so the main issue here was that they just only had circumstantial evidence, mostly of eyewitnesses. There was one eyewitness that put him at the scene of the sorority house around the time that the attacks happened, and there was another eyewitness that said that she saw him leaving the house with the murder weapon. And that sounds like pretty damning evidence, but the problem with witness testimony is that it could be strong, however, the jury determines whether or not the witness is credible, so the evidence is only as strong as the credibility of your witness. So if the defense is able to come up and do what's called impeach the witness by offering evidence of maybe their history of lying or perjury or something, or call into question their motive as to why they're testifying that day, it can poke enough holes in the witness's testimony to weaken it to the point of the jury determining not to actually give much weight to it and not to believe the witness. They also presented bite mark evidence because he had bitten one of the victims. That kind of evidence has also been debunked as being not very accurate. The way that bite marks bruise or appear on skin after the fact varies depending on the person's body and how it reacts to trauma. And so it's not really actually that accurate to take a casting of someone's teeth and then see if it looks like the bruises on someone's leg, for example. However, in this case, Ted Bundy was acting as his own attorney, and I think he was probably pretty bad at it. And at one point he called himself to the witness stand. He spoke to himself and about himself in the third person. It was all basically this weird show. And he ended up being convicted of both the murders and handed 2 death sentences. 6 months later, in January of 1980, Bundy was tried for the murder of the 12-year-old girl, Kimberly Leach. There he did not act as his own attorney, and his attorney had him plead not guilty for reasons of insanity. Insanity is basically a defense to a murder charge. It's saying, yes, I did it, but I was incapacitated at the time. Usually it's used to negate intent, which means in this case you have to have intent if it's premeditated murder, and if he was not mentally capable of understanding the nature of his actions or the consequences of them due to insanity, then that would negate the intent aspect of the crime, and he couldn't be found guilty of premeditated murder. The jury didn't buy that defense though, and the prosecution offered more eyewitness testimony, this time from a person who said they saw him driving a white van near the school, and testimony from another witness who said that they saw him with Kimberly heading to the van by the school on that day. Again, really damning evidence, but the jury has to determine whether or not that witness is credible. That, combined with the fiber evidence that they found from his jacket that was also on Kimberly's body, was enough to convince the jury that he did commit the murder, and they convicted him of the murder. In one final Ted Bundy spectacle, he called his then girlfriend to the witness stand, and through this obscure Florida law asked her to marry him. She said yes, and then there was a notary there that signed a document, and they were supposedly legally married on the spot during his trial. Anyway, he was found guilty and he was handed his 3rd death sentence. And then in the years that followed, Bundy mounted a number of appeals against his conviction and his death sentence, which just means that he went to the court above the court that convicted him and asked them to overturn, overrule, or declare a mistrial or order a new trial for him in each of the convictions. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals did actually order a stay on his execution 15 hours before it was scheduled. They cited a few procedural errors that he had pointed out on appeal, which is valid. Procedural errors can lead to injustices. Basically, the Court of Appeals said that it was questionable whether or not he was actually competent to have stood trial the way that he did. I mean, he was representing himself, so I'm sure there was quite a bit of questionable things that went on in that scenario. And apparently the jury in that Chi Omega case was 6-6 on whether or not to give him the life sentence versus the death penalty, and the judge gave them an instruction that apparently was potentially erroneous, so this Court of Appeals sent the case back down to be tried again. Then in 1986, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals again issued a temporary stay on his death sentence related to the killing of Kimberly Leach. However, after review, the 11th Circuit decided to uphold his conviction, and his death sentence was finally scheduled. And Ted Bundy was executed via electric chair in 1989. So those were the major Ted Bundy cases. That's how he ended up getting put behind bars and eventually executed. And I guess the larger question might be, okay, he was convicted for 3 of his murders, and ultimately only, I mean, you can only be put to death once, but he only was actually upheld that 1 death sentence. What about the 30+ other people that he allegedly murdered? What about their families? What about the justice that they seek? We have this idea in our court system that we're allowed our day in court to have justice. However, in situations like this, where there were multiple murder victims across many states, a lot of whom their bodies were never found, the evidence deteriorated, there wasn't enough evidence to begin with, means that a lot of these families didn't get any justice for the victims. Sometimes families of victims can get justice in civil court. If you're being tried for murder, you're in criminal court. Civil court is where people can sue each other for things. The government can also sue people, but largely it's known for being the place where people can sue each other for harms that they've committed against each other. In civil court, families can bring wrongful death claims and other types of claims against the alleged murderers of their family members. Interestingly, in civil court, the burden of proof is lower than in criminal court. So sometimes someone can be acquitted of a crime but still have to pay the family for the crime. For example, in O.J. Simpson's trial, he was acquitted of the murder of his ex-wife. However, her family then sued him in civil court and he ended up having to pay them damages for wrongful death. So there are instances where maybe he gets acquitted or you don't get that trial in court for the murder or the crime, but you sue the person and you can at least get monetary damages for your pain and suffering, which is hard to calculate but is better than nothing. The problem is, however, that someone like O.J. Simpson is worth suing in civil court because he was rich and had a lot of money to pay. Someone like Ted Bundy, who was pretty much destitute, isn't worth bringing a case against in civil court because even if you won a judgment against him, he wouldn't have any money. He'd be what's called judgment proof, which means that there's just no assets that you could take from that person. So it doesn't make sense to sue them in the first place because you'd be spending so much money on lawyers' fees and everything, and you would get nothing in return for your civil lawsuit. A lot of these families didn't get to have their day in court, didn't get to have any closure on the murders of their family members. They got to at least rest well knowing that the murderer of their child or their sister was likely in prison, but they never got the conclusion of an actual criminal trial. And that's how our justice system works. And that's what it's like to try a serial killer. So that's the legal tale of Ted Bundy. I hope you found it interesting. I hope maybe you learned some new things, even if you are a true crime fan and have already heard the Ted Bundy story. If there's other true crime that you want me to look into on the legal side of things, comment below. I kind of want to make this into like a series and do a few more of these because I know they're fun and they're fun for me to do. So comment below if you have any ideas. Please hit that thumbs up button if you found this video informational or entertaining, and hit subscribe if you want to hear more from me. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Goodbye.